My name is Daniel. I am 55 years old. Last weekend, I stood behind a smoking grill at a luxury barbecue in South Lake flipping steaks for my son's future in-laws. When his girlfriend's father pointed at me and asked who was manning the grill, my son did not hesitate. He wrapped an arm around his fiancée, looked right past me and said, "Oh, him. He is just the estate manager we hired to handle the catering today." The wealthy guests nodded approvingly. My own boy smiled, and I just kept turning the meat. I did not say a word. I just wiped my hands on my apron, because that is exactly what a hired servant is expected to do. What those people clinking their expensive glasses did not know was that a few hours later, that same arrogant father-in-law would be staring at me in absolute terror. They did not know the multi-million-dollar mansion they were standing in belonged to my private firm, and that the servant grilling their dinner was about to become their biggest creditor. They just never thought to ask whose name was actually on the property deed. If you have ever been denied by your own flesh and blood, you will understand the feeling of your heart not breaking, but completely freezing over. I would love to hear how you survived it. So drop your story in the comments below. And if you are watching this on YouTube, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you are going to want to see the exact moment I stopped saving them from themselves. I looked down at the dark grease stain on my old apron, then at my son's fake smile across the patio. To understand why he could utter such heartless words so easily, you need to know about the final clause in the divorce settlement I signed 20 years ago, a clause that stripped away my right to be a father. The pen felt like lead in my calloused hand as I stared at the thick legal document resting on the polished mahogany table. 20 years ago, the air inside that downtown law office was suffocating. Sitting directly across from me was Pamela, my soon-to-be ex-wife. She was a woman utterly consumed by the fear of poverty, and she had meticulously designed this moment to ensure she would never have to struggle again. I had already agreed to surrender our modest home and the entirety of our meager savings just to keep the proceedings civil. But Pamela demanded one final crushing stipulation. The contract dictated I was only permitted to visit my 6-year-old son 2 weekends a month. Furthermore, it explicitly barred me from having any voice in his educational orientation or future schooling decisions. I signed the papers with a heavy heart, foolishly believing that my relentless hard work and unconditional love would eventually bridge whatever gap the legal system created. I was entirely wrong. Less than a year after the ink dried, Pamela married a man named Harrington. He was a wealthy investment fund director, a polished executive who measured human worth strictly by the designer label inside his suit jacket. He quickly moved my ex-wife and my little boy into a sprawling gated estate. Meanwhile, I relocated to a dilapidated house on the rural outskirts of the county. I took on punishing hours inside a sweltering woodshop. I breathed in toxic sawdust and accumulated deep permanent scars across my knuckles just to ensure my child support checks always cleared on time. I poured every ounce of my physical strength into proving I was a responsible, dedicated father. However, Harrington weaponized his massive fortune to systematically obliterate my presence in the boy's life. He easily bypassed my financial contributions by funding Nolan's enrollment at the most elite private academy in the state. He purchased extravagant gifts, lavish vacations, and eventually a luxury vehicle the moment the boy turned 16. He provided a life of absolute excess that my sweat-stained dollars could never possibly match, silently teaching the child that real power came from a checkbook instead of honest labor. As the decades slipped away, the emotional distance between my son and me widened into a cold, uncrossable chasm. Whenever I drove my battered Ford pickup truck into their pristine neighborhood for my scheduled visits, Nolan would look at me with undisguised disgust. He despised the lingering smell of wood varnish on my flannel shirts. He rolled his eyes at my heavy work boots. Pamela had successfully poisoned his mind, teaching him that my silent, grueling sacrifices were nothing more than the pathetic struggles of a miserable failure. By the time his 18th birthday arrived, the brainwashing was absolute. I parked my old truck down the street from their mansion, holding a custom wooden box I had spent 3 weeks carving by hand. Nolan stepped out onto the driveway, took one look at my vehicle, and flatly refused to get inside. He coldly stated that his wealthy friends might drive by and see him sitting in such garbage. I drove back to my empty house alone, realizing I had permanently lost my flesh and blood to the cult of money. That contempt, nurtured by those expensive tuition invoices, eventually turned into a fatal stab delivered on a summer morning 4 years ago. The university stadium was a sea of black gowns and flying caps on that sweltering May morning. I stood near the very back of the bleachers, clutching a rolled-up program in my sweating hands. I had worn my only decent button-down shirt, carefully ironed the night before, yet I remained hidden behind a row of cheering families. I had closed my shop for the entire day, losing precious wages just to witness this milestone. However, Nolan had made it explicitly clear, weeks prior, that my presence in the VIP section would only cause unnecessary embarrassment. He reserved the prime seating strictly for Pamela and Harrington. The ceremony progressed smoothly until the honor students were called to the podium. My son walked proudly across the stage, the bright morning sun catching the gold tassel swinging from his cap. He took the microphone to deliver a brief student address, adjusting it with a confident smirk that perfectly mirrored his stepfather. My chest swelled with a foolish, desperate pride, hoping for just a fleeting glance in my direction. Instead, he looked directly at the front row, his voice echoing loudly through the massive stadium speakers. If it were not for Mr. Harrington, I would not be standing here today. The crowd applauded warmly. They were completely unaware that a biological father was standing in the shadows, listening to his 2 decades of grueling labor and child support payments be erased in a single callous sentence. I turned around and walked out of the stadium before the applause even faded. The emotional betrayal was merely the beginning of the nightmare. The fatal financial blow arrived just a few weeks later. 3 years prior, I had taken out a substantial commercial loan to expand my woodshop, purchasing new industrial equipment and leasing adjacent land. I made every single monthly installment perfectly on time. What I did not realize was that the local community bank holding my mortgage had recently been aggressively acquired by a massive private equity firm. That specific investment portfolio was directed by none other than Harrington. When the regional timber market experienced a mild temporary downturn, that autumn, my shop's theoretical valuation dipped slightly. It was a standard industry fluctuation, absolutely nothing that threatened my actual daily operation or cash flow. However, the new corporate ownership immediately invoked an obscure, predatory covenant buried deep within the original loan documents. They aggressively demanded the entire remaining balance be paid in full within 30 days. It was a mathematically impossible demand. I frantically attempted to refinance through other lenders, but the timeline was deliberately engineered to crush me. I submitted desperate appeals, bringing in ledgers, proving that my order books were completely full and my revenue was stable. The faceless banking executives simply ignored my paperwork. They didn't just want their money returned, they wanted my livelihood destroyed. Pamela and Harrington had finally found a legal, sterile method to scrub the dirty carpenter from their pristine lives forever. The local sheriff arrived to lock the gates, placing heavy chains across the doors I had built with my own bare hands. Standing and watching my woodshop being sealed by the bank at the age of 51, I understood that I could no longer use my sweat to pay for the greed of others. I scraped together the absolute last remnants of my depleted savings to purchase a charred, collapsed residential property on the forgotten fringes of the county. The roof had caved in completely, leaving a skeletal frame of blackened timber that smelled heavily of damp soot, wet ash, and total despair. With absolutely nowhere else to go, I moved a stained mattress directly into the gutted remains of the living room. I spent the freezing winter nights wrapped in cheap sleeping bags, staring up at the exposed stars through the broken rafters, and the grueling daylight hours rebuilding the structure entirely by hand. Every single commercial lender I approached for a basic construction loan immediately rejected my applications without a second thought. My financial profile was practically radioactive after the recent foreclosure, and suited loan officers openly sneered at the sight of a middle-aged carpenter pitching a real estate turnaround strategy. Out of sheer desperation, I was forced to surrender a massive percentage of my projected equity to an independent angel investor just to afford raw building materials and copper wiring. For 2 agonizing years, I existed strictly on cheap canned soup and functioned on less than 4 hours of sleep per night. I hammered every single nail, poured every concrete footing, and laid every inch of hardwood flooring myself. When my investor and I finally sold that meticulously restored property, my personal profit margin was practically non-existent, but I had successfully proven my business model to a highly skeptical market. I immediately rolled that tiny seed capital into a second abandoned house, then a third, operating with a ruthless, calculated efficiency. Slowly, my scarred hands transformed complete ruins into highly desirable suburban homes. Then, the regional economic landscape shifted dramatically in my favor. The South Lake real estate market suddenly exploded with unprecedented demand from incoming corporate executives and wealthy transplants seeking massive properties. At the exact same time, several arrogant, over-leveraged developers defaulted on their massive portfolios. Using the liquid cash reserves I had violently scraped together, I began aggressively acquiring premium foreclosed assets directly from the very banking institutions that had previously dismissed me. I bought their failures for pennies on the dollar. I established a private development firm, completely shielded behind a complex web of anonymous corporate entities. I purchased sprawling luxury estates, renovated them to absolute perfection, and leased them exclusively to the ultra-wealthy elite. The monthly cash flow became a torrential river. Within a remarkably short span, the disgraced woodworker transformed into a silent, untouchable tycoon operating deep within the shadows of South Lake's wealthiest zip codes. I possessed a staggering real estate empire, yet I remained entirely invisible to the outside world. I still drove my battered pickup truck and wore my frayed flannel shirts because I no longer needed expensive fabric to confirm my absolute power. About 6 months before today's barbecue, when I began silently accumulating Lockwood Corporation bonds, I had no idea this financial net was about to catch some remarkably uninvited guests. The unexpected phone call arrived late on a Tuesday evening. I barely recognized the caller ID. It had been nearly 4 years since my son last reached out to me, yet his tone carried zero hesitation or warmth. Nolan spoke rapidly, dispensing instructions with the crisp cadence of an entitled executive ordering a subordinate around. He informed me that he was hosting an intimate gathering for his fiancée's wealthy parents, the Lockwoods, at his newly acquired mega mansion in South Lake. He needed a free body to stand over an open flame for several hours, casually mentioning that paying a professional catering company seemed completely unnecessary when he had a manual laborer for a biological father. I listened to his pompous boasting in complete silence. He went on to describe the architectural details of the massive estate he claimed to have just purchased, completely unaware that I had personally approved those exact blueprints 9 months earlier. I simply agreed to show up. I arrived at the property 3 hours before the scheduled event to prepare the outdoor kitchen. Walking through the imposing wrought iron gates, I quietly observed the flawless landscaping and the towering limestone columns of my own private investment. Nolan was pacing nervously around the extravagant patio, barking final arrangements into his cell phone while entirely ignoring my presence. He had directed me toward the service entrance, instructing me to remain completely out of sight until the guests demanded their food. I unpacked my tools, tied a stained apron over my shirt, and began arranging the expensive cuts of meat. While adjusting the temperature dials on the commercial grill, I noticed a sleek tablet resting on the edge of the granite prep counter. Nolan had carelessly abandoned his device there while rushing inside to fetch a vintage wine bottle. Suddenly, the screen illuminated brightly displaying an active chat window with Pamela. My eyes caught a freshly sent outgoing message that was impossible to ignore. It read, "I told the Lockwoods this house is in my name. Make sure the carpenter keeps his mouth shut tonight. Do not let him know anything about the lease." I stared at the glowing text as the reality of the situation fully crystallized. Any lingering traces of paternal anger instantly evaporated, replaced by an absolute, freezing contempt. My son was not merely trying to hide his working-class roots from high society. He was actively orchestrating a massive financial illusion. He had rented one of my luxury properties through a third-party management broker and was aggressively defrauding his future in-laws to secure his position within their elite circle. The pathetic magnitude of his charade disgusted me. He was willing to sell his soul and erase his own flesh and blood just to maintain a fragile lie built on leased marble. Holding tight to that cold contempt in my chest, I calmly picked up the last beef rib, placed it onto the silver tray, and strode straight toward the banquet table, ringing with laughter. The crystal wine glasses chimed together just as I set the heavy silver tray onto the center of the long dining table. Mr. Lockwood was already on his feet, holding a glass of vintage Cabernet high in the warm evening air. He was a man who practically radiated old money, yet his current financial desperation was perfectly concealed beneath a custom-tailored Italian suit. He beamed warmly at my son, loudly praising Nolan for his remarkable early success and extensively complimenting the breathtaking architecture of the sprawling estate. Nolan soaked in the unearned adulation with a sickeningly modest smile, while Pamela and Harrington nodded along like proud royalty holding court. Naturally, none of them paid the slightest attention to the hired help, standing quietly at the edge of the illuminated patio. I waited patiently for the toast to conclude, and the polite applause to fade away entirely into the night. Then I reached behind my back and deliberately untied the greasy apron. I let the stained fabric fall directly onto the pristine limestone pavers. The sudden, highly unorthodox gesture caught Pamela's eye first. Her patronizing smile instantly vanished quickly, replaced by a sharp, furious glare of warning. I ignored her completely. Reaching inside the inner breast pocket of my shirt, I withdrew a sharply folded legal document I had retrieved from my private office earlier that afternoon. I tossed the thick paper directly onto the dining table, letting it land right next to Mr. Lockwood's expensive porcelain dinner plate. The lively conversation abruptly died. Nolan finally looked at me, his eyes stretching wide with a sudden frantic panic. He aggressively opened his mouth to order me back to the outdoor kitchen, but I raised a single calloused hand to silence him. The absolute authority in my silent gesture froze the words right in his throat. I looked directly at the wealthy patriarch, sitting comfortably at the head of the table. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady, slicing through the heavy Texas humidity. I politely informed Mr. Lockwood that there had been a rather significant misunderstanding regarding the evening's formal introductions. I stated clearly that I was not a temporary estate manager or a hired caterer. I casually tapped the legal document resting on the table, explaining that the paper was a standard short-term rental agreement signed exactly 3 days ago by Nolan. I watched the blood completely drain from my son's face as I explicitly clarified that the multi-million-dollar property they were currently admiring belonged entirely to my private development firm. A suffocating silence descended upon the lavish garden. Pamela gripped the edge of the table so fiercely her knuckles turned entirely white. Harrington sat completely paralyzed in his chair, his jaw practically unhinged in absolute disbelief. Clara looked back and forth between Nolan and me in sheer horror. The magnificent illusion my son had constructed was instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces, brutally exposed by the very father he had tried to erase. Mr. Lockwood stared up at me, his aristocratic face contorting into a mask of pure shock and deep confusion. He stammered, demanding to know exactly who I was and what was actually happening. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or gloat. I simply reached down, calmly fastened the cuffs of my shirt, and met his panicked gaze with absolute, chilling indifference. "Mr. Lockwood," I said, quietly, ensuring every single syllable carried the crushing weight of reality. "We will discuss the details of your extensive debts at the shareholder meeting next week." Leaving behind the people frozen in dead silence, I turned my back and walked out of the oak doors without looking back once. The devastating consequences materialized gradually, yet with absolute surgical precision. By Wednesday morning, the extravagant high society wedding was officially postponed indefinitely. Mr. Lockwood, desperately scrambling to stabilize his own sinking corporate ship before my executive board took immediate action, ruthlessly liquidated every single financial asset he held within Harrington's private investment portfolio. That sudden, massive capital withdrawal instantly triggered a catastrophic economic chain reaction. Within 48 hours, federal financial regulatory commissions launched a formal, highly publicized investigation into Harrington's firm regarding severe liquidity shortages and potential corporate fraud. The glittering empire built on designer suits, unearned arrogance, and predatory banking completely collapsed into worthless dust. Nolan immediately lost his wealthy fiancée, his fraudulently leased mega mansion, and his entire elite social standing in one sweeping motion. Pamela's luxurious daily existence abruptly evaporated as their primary banking accounts were officially frozen by the authorities pending the intensive federal audit. The lifelong illusion of their absolute superiority shattered irrevocably. Late Friday night, the perimeter security monitors inside my quiet study chimed softly. The high-definition camera feed displayed a profoundly pathetic scene out by the heavy iron gates of my primary residence. Pamela and Nolan were standing together in the freezing, relentless autumn rain. My son was frantically pressing the brass intercom button, weeping openly, and pleading for his father to please answer the speaker. Pamela stood shivering furiously beside him, sobbing directly into the camera lens, begging for financial mercy, desperate forgiveness, and a completely unearned second chance to rebuild our permanently broken family. I sat completely still in my leather armchair, silently watching the black and white monitor. I did not yell through the intercom system to berate them or demand pathetic apologies. I did not even bother dispatching my private security team to chase them off the private property. I simply watched them shiver in the bitter cold. My hand never once moved toward the electronic gate release button. I realized right then that my ultimate retaliation was not a deliberate aggressive act of vengeance. The most lethal punishment I could possibly inflict was the absolute permanent withdrawal of my salvation. I simply refused to extend my hand to pull them out of the water. If you are watching this video while carrying the crushing emotional weight of a toxic family dynamic, I need you to internalize a fundamental truth right now. Enduring relentless disrespect and psychological abuse is never a valid demonstration of unconditional love. Severing ties with people who happen to share your genetic bloodline is not an unforgivable act of cruelty. It is a mandatory requirement for your own self-preservation and mental survival. You absolutely do not owe your peace of mind to those who actively attempted to destroy your life. Sometimes, the most devastating and powerful response to profound betrayal does not involve plotting a vicious, loud counterattack. It is simply standing entirely still, keeping your own doors firmly locked, and peacefully allowing those toxic individuals to finally drown in the exact same chaotic, inescapable mess they built with their own greedy hands.